Good afternoon, and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at myth&realities.com. Arnold Joseph Toynbee was a British historian born in London in 1889. He attended Balliol College of Oxford University. Toynbee's conversations with his son Peter were written in a book. There, Peter asks his dad, "What is your first book?" Toynbee replies, "I started writing my first book before the World War I. It was published in 1915 or 1916, entitled The Nationalities and the War." Toynbee's first book was actually a 159-page book of war propaganda that he never mentions among his works. Toynbee tells his son Peter that his second book is Western Question in Greece and Turkey, which was published in 1922. It is interesting to note that someone who is proud of his work does not mention some of the books that carry his signature. He denounced all material published in various magazines and books that he wrote, but were based on the say-so of the Christian missionaries and Armenians alone. Publishers do not mention the Blue Book among the list of other books written by Arnold Toynbee. Only on the internet does one come across the claims of Arnold Toynbee and Lord Bryce mentioning the Blue Book. One of the participants, Professor Berin Yurdado, contributed during the question period that Lord Bryce wrote in his book's preface, "While I was thinking that I had material to condemn the Turks, I found a 26-year-old young historian," he means Arnold Toynbee, "to write the book." Toynbee never mentioned the Blue Book among his books. He always refers to Western Question as his first book on Turkey. Apparently, he lost his job for ferrying the Turks in that book. In very simple terms, that book can be summarized as follows. If the French had not supported the Armenians, and if the British didn't support the Greeks, there would not be a Western Question. In 1961, when Professor Berin Yurdado met Toynbee in Turkey, she told him that she had read the fierce things that he wrote about the Turks. He asked, "How did you come across those things? Couldn't things have changed since then?" Professor Hikmet Ozdemir said that Toynbee has become an international guru for historians at that time. In 1973, Toynbee and a Japanese intellectual named Ikada published a book based on their conversations. There, Toynbee says, "The Americans were surprised in Vietnam when they noticed that the Vietnamese were not animals or a plant species, but human beings." Professor Ozdemir thinks this awareness is how Toynbee and others felt about the Turks and Ottoman Muslims when they met them in Anatolia during World War I. In his 1915 book, Nationality and the War, Toynbee proposed post-World War I peace settlement based on the principle of nationality. In his 1916 book, The New Europe, Essays in Reconstruction, Toynbee criticized the concept of natural borders for providing a justification for additional wars, so that countries can reach their natural borders. He opined once a country reached one set of natural borders, it could aim to attain another one and another one. As an alternative to the idea of natural borders, Toynbee proposed international regionalism, where facilitating free trade, partnership, and cooperation between various neighboring countries would reduce the need for countries to expand due to their interconnectedness of their economies. If this were true, though, globalism, which can be viewed as the unification of all the international regionalisms, should almost eliminate the wars. And we know today that that is not the case. Globalism has its own and different kind of conquests with its own new tools like investments, divestments, boycotts, and sanctions, leading to industrial alliances, trade camps, and polarization. Exploring the concepts of international regionalism and globalism are beyond the scope of this discussion. I have touched upon it only in the context of what Toynbee proposed as a solution a century ago, benefiting from the hindsight of looking back today. On one hand, Toynbee advocated making national borders based on the principle of national self-determination, as in which country the people in a particular area or territory actually wanted to live in. But on the other, he endorsed the idea of having Tsarist Russia annex much of Eastern Anatolia. This is very surprising, if not also hypocritical. While Toynbee was busy writing that propaganda material known as the Blue Book, defaming all Turks and making all Armenians appear as helpless angels, and thus fueling the Armenian aspirations for expansion, he was also proposing that Tsarist Russia annex Eastern Anatolia. It must be easy to sit at a table like Toynbee did, open up the map, and just draw lines as international borders, as the British love to do. Remember the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916? The product of British and French collective greed, arrogance, and hubris? His Royal Highness, historian par excellence, Toynbee, suggests that Tsarist Russia should carve out much of the Ottoman East with millions of Muslims, mostly Turks, on it, and happily rule there ever after. So whatever happened to the self-determination rights of the Turks? If this is not the epitome of prejudice, I don't know what is. Because this right was not extended to the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, the Paris Peace Conference could only produce that stillborn Sevres Treaty on August 10, 1920. This same criticism is also directed at President Woodrow Wilson for suggesting a greater Armenia on Ottoman lands where the Armenians would be a minority. Put in another way, self-determination rights, if extended equally to the people of Anatolia, would certainly deny all of those areas in Wilson's Sevres map to the Armenians. The truth is, self-determination rights were offered to Christian communities, not the Muslim ones. Call it hypocrisy, prejudice, hubris, arrogance, or whatever you like. That is why the Turks, insulted and humiliated by the Sevres Treaty, ripped that Sevres Treaty apart, revved up their war of independence with a great conviction, passion, and commitment and sacrifice. The British Wartime Disinformation Report, under the title The Treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in 1915 and 1916, which came to be known as the Blue Book, was formulated by Arnold Toynbee, a member of the Masterman Propaganda Bureau in London, on the instigation of Viscount James Bryce. Lord Bryce's claim to fame is inciting the Armenian militants to rebellion since the publication of his book entitled Transcaucasia and Ararat in 1877, in which he remarked on page 344, I quote, "Why do the Armenians not rise in rebellion as their forefathers did against the Seleucids and the Persians?" Unquote. After the massive armed rebellions of Ottoman Armenians in 1914-1915, on the instigation of the Allies, mainly Russia, France, and Britain, in order to dismember the Ottoman Empire, a civil war erupted between the Armenians and Turks. The British intelligence and information services, some political and military advisors, and Armenophile enthusiasts like Lord Bryce, Arnold Toynbee, and others urged the British government to publicize the Turco-Armenian incidents as Armenian massacres. For domestic politics, it was calculated that this would arouse more interest among the British public in the Armenians and hatred towards the Turks. For foreign politics, it would divert attention, international attention, from the atrocious persecution of the Jews by Russia, Britain's ally. It would also stimulate, it was hoped, the neutral countries like the United States with pro-entente tendencies to join the Allies. Harold D. Laswell, on page 62 of his book titled Propaganda Techniques in the World War, published in New York in 1927, stated that the Allies indulged in exercise of propaganda disinformation during the First World War. On page 66, he explained why, I quote, A, in order to establish friendly relations with neutral states, and B, to convince those states of justice in their war aims and to procure their support. On page 72, Laswell was more graphic when he noted the Allies knew that the best way to draw the neutrals to their side was portraying their enemies as inhuman creatures. That is exactly what the Blue Book aimed to do. Toynbee and the notorious Turkophobe Viscount Bryce tackled the task of collecting the materials, mainly from Armenian sources, via the American ambassador to Turkey, Morgenthau, and writing the report. At this point, I would like to recommend two books on how the propaganda material was collected and masterfully devised. One is Arthur Ponsonby's Falsehood in Wartime, published in New York in 1928. And the other is Michael Sanderson and Philip Taylor's joint work titled British Propaganda During the First World War, 1914-1918, published in London, 1983. The British Foreign Office were anxious to have the report published in order to stimulate the Allies' war effort. The Blue Book came out in 1916 and hit the nail on the head. It turned out to be one of the most successful wartime propaganda efforts by the British government. It used it in defaming its enemies, the Turks, and cultivating hatred towards them before the world opinion. The wavering pro-Entente neutrals, in particular the USA, was won over. Most of the material used in the Blue Book was supplied to Lord Bryce by the US ambassador in Istanbul, Henry Morgenthau, who in turn relied on his two Armenian aides. Please see episode 14 for more information, or read Heath Laurie's book, The Story Behind Ambassador Morgenthau's Story, published in Istanbul in 1990. Bryce passed on the information to the young historian Toynbee, who became a specialist in atrocity propaganda. The Blue Book was the result of compiling various documents from Armenian and Armenophile sources without checking their accuracy. They were mostly secondary and tertiary sources procured with the help of Morgenthau. It was issued as an official report in order to give it credibility. The work was hastily completed in less than a year. Scholars must judge for themselves as to how authentic this work can be. Toynbee, at first, considered it as the biggest asset of His Majesty's government to solve the Turkish problem in a radical manner and to have it accepted by the public. But later, Toynbee confessed that the British government had published the Blue Book for a special purpose, of which he was unaware at the time, which is a lie. He stated that the Russian armies, when retreating across the Polish-Lithuanian frontier in the spring of 1915, had committed many barbarities against the Jews there. The advancing German armies had tried to exploit them, which disturbed the British government. The New York American had suggested on February 2nd, 1916, that American people demand that Christian England and Christian France restrain the savagery of their barbarous Russian allies. Toynbee thought that the British government was concerned in case the American Jewry react against the Allies by throwing its weight against the Allies in the public debate then going on in America. Therefore, the Turco-Armenian incidents in Anatolia had provided the British government with counter-propaganda material against the Central Powers. On pages 81 and 110 of the book by Mossa Anderson and Noel Buxton, titled A Life, published in London, 1952, we read that Henry Herbert Asquith and Stanley Baldwin, in their joint memorial in 1924 to the then Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, say this, I quote, "The Blue Book was widely used for Allied propaganda in 1916-17 and had an important influence upon American opinion and the ultimate decision of President Woodrow Wilson to enter the war," unquote. The Blue Book, magnum opus of British wartime propaganda with a devastating effect, still spreads its venomous influence today as the book is being abused by dishonest Armenian activists in perpetuating their hatred towards the Turks, and by certain uncritical scholars. It was based on atrocity stories, as British propaganda was mostly geared towards, real or imagined, embellished, falsified, concocted, or fabricated. It didn't matter. You can read about this on page 298 of the book Lucy Masterman wrote, F.G. Masterman, 1939. Disinformers could slip them to journalists who would sensationalize them under banner headlines in their publications. You can read further on pages 120 and 121 of the book by Sidney Whitman, Turkish Memories, published in London, 1914. Arthur Ponsonby's penetrating comments on page 14 of his book, I referenced earlier, are appropriate here. I quote, "The injection of the poison of hatred into men's mind by means of falsehood is a greater evil in wartime than actual loss of life. The desecration of the human soul is worse than the destruction of the human body," unquote. The so-called corpse conversation factory was perhaps one of the most notorious atrocity stories of the entire war. The Germans were accused of boiling down corpses to make soap. The story was completely a hoax, and it was exposed in 1925 when at the House of Commons, You can read more about this on pages 147 and 148 of Hansard 5th edition, volume 188, published on January 24, 1925. Most of the wartime atrocities stories were fabricated, falsified, or embellished, just like the myth of the deliberate extermination of the Ottoman Armenians in 1915. Please note that Britain officially apologized to Germany for wartime slanders, but failed to do so to Turkey. On page 187 of the book titled Atrocity Propaganda, 1914-1919, Yale, 1941, James Morgan Reed, perhaps in an effort to whitewash the British government remarks, says this, I quote, "Lying is an act of conscious deception. Much of British atrocity propaganda was unconscious deception built upon erroneous reports and impressions," unquote. So he agrees that the Blue Book was based on lies, but he blames erroneous reports for that. One may ask why Britain's World War I propaganda division, Wellington House, was established in the first place. Sanders and Taylor state on page 265 that it was the British government itself between 1914 and 1918 that had demonstrated to the world the enormous power of propaganda, a legacy which later propagandists followed suit. This chart from the British archives gives an excellent idea of Britain's World War I propaganda division, Wellington House. Its scope reached far and wide throughout the globe. At Wellington House, under the command of Masterman, there were dozens of people coordinating the distribution of propaganda through books, pamphlets, and newspapers, and other publications and exhibitions. Looks like they had even a literary agent facilitating contracts with publishing houses. At middle right, under the House of Lords, there was coordination for the press, the cables, and the cinema. At far left, Wellington House, man Arnold Toynbee appears in the section of enemy nations to be demonized under Ottoman Empire, Mesopotamia, Arabia, Egypt. So there was nothing unconscious about the mass deception Britain perpetrated during World War I. One curious question has to be, if the Blue Book contents were so factual and so truthful, then why did the British Crown Prosecutor refuse to use them at the Malta Tribunal during 1919-1921 to prosecute the 144 Ottoman leaders exiled to the island of Malta? This might also explain the position of the British government today in not recognizing the alleged Armenian genocide. According to the official website of the UK Parliament, you can find it at www.parliament.uk, Martin Day submitted the written question number 41788 on July 4, 2016. He asked the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs whether the government plans to recognize the mass killings of Armenians, Armenian Christians by the Ottoman Empire as genocide, unquote. It was answered by Mr. David Lidington on July 12, 2016 as follows. It is the policy of the UK government that recognition of genocide is a matter for judicial decision rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. While the terrible suffering cannot be forgotten and we must continue to remember and honor the victims of the past, we believe the UK's priority today should be to promote reconciliation between the peoples and governments of Turkey and Armenia, and not to find a way to polarize or find a way for these two countries to face their joint history together. This is a right and honorable position for any decent government to take. President Biden failed miserably on this test of principles. He could not overcome his ethno-religious bias against Turks and his Islamophobia and the constant pestering by the dishonest and racist Armenian lobby, and uttered the G word on April 24th, 2021, a date that will live in infamy. Will the Armenian lobby finally open their archives for the world to see? Will there be a joint historians committee to study those and other archives? Can there be a civilized dialogue to discuss shared pain and just memory? Will the Armenian lobby reconsider its use of long discredited propaganda material as evidence for their baseless political claim of genocide? Or will they continue to deceive the unsuspecting public? Will the genocide industry stop using proven fallacies in their essays and books? Will the Armenians finally open their archives so that we can all learn about the details of myriad international schemes they hatched before, during, and after the World War I? These are all great topics to explore some other time. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week.